Hey, today I want to talk about Domo's new data modeling feature and how it can help you make better sense of your data that you have in your Domo instance. So to begin, this is really what a data model ultimately looks like. And what I'm going to talk about today and show you is how to create a Domo stats data model where we're taking different Domo stats reports. And instead of doing a magic ETL or a dataset view, we're actually joining it up together into a unified data model, and then we can create cards and visualizations off of that data model. So to really understand this, we really have to go back to entity relationship diagrams. And so this is funny because in college, I studied accounting, but I had one class about databases, and this class was about entity relationship diagrams, ERDs. And it really is relatable to what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about this real quick. But really, what is an ERD? So an ERD, it's a visual blueprint that maps out how data, so entities like people, objects, and concepts relate to each other within a system. So basically, an entity, you can think of it as a thing or an object, such as a customer, a product, an order, things that would be data sets in your Domo instance. And then the ERD describes the relationships between them. And so we'll talk a little bit about cardinality, things like that. But ultimately, to explain this better, I always like to do like a practical example. And so I'm going to come over here to my Lucid chart, and we are going to create an ERD, and we're going to create a very simple one. In this case, we're going to do it as if I was going to a grocery store. I'm going to create an ERD for my shopping list and for my order that I purchased at the grocery store. And so the first thing I'm going to do is like the ERD talks about, each entity is going to be visualized by a box. And so I'll drag a box out here, and I'll just call this my order box, right? So this will be the receipt that I get at the grocery store, and it'll just contain everything in my order, right? So in this case, like the milk that I bought, the Lunchables, love me some Lunchables, stuff like that. And then we're going to drag out another box, and we're going to say this will be our order line items, right? So in this case, if we think about a grocery order, each grocery order more than likely has multiple line items in it, right? So maybe I had 15 things that I checked out of the grocery store. In this case, now we're going to talk about how these two entities are related, right? So an order, I'm going to drag out here a line and say that an order can have multiple line items. An order has multiple line items. Perfect. And then, right, so this is saying that the order has multiple line items, and then the order line items can only be associated to one order, right? So if I purchase a can of Coke, it can't be tied to multiple orders, right? Multiple people can't purchase the same can of Coke. It has to be on a single order. And so that's really important because this kind of talks about cardinality, right? So in this case, I'm just going to type this out. A line item can only be related to a single order. And so this is called cardinality between entities. And the way that this is done actually is there is this funny notation called crow's feet that simplifies this whole thing, right? So instead of having to like write all this text, I can actually draw a simple line over here and say an order can have multiple line items. So in that case, I'm going to change my ultimate thing to this little crow's feet is what we call it. I just need to change it here to crow's feet. And then an ordered line item can only be associated to a single order. So in this case, we'll change this terminator to be this little guy right here. Let me just make this a little thicker to show you. And so this right here is basically our first cardinality that we've created, right? In this case, an order has multiple line items, and the line item can only be associated to a single order. And this looks very similar to the data modeling that we're doing in Domo, right? You can see it's actually, we're dragging boxes out. And in this case, these lines that we're doing are actually the cardinalities between the different data sets. And so I know we went through a little bit there, but what I would recommend is anytime you're working with a data model, you'll always see me, like when I'm working in data models, I'm always going to be doing this funny thing where I'm saying, okay, an order can have multiple line items, and then the line items can only be to one order. Like I'll be doing that, I'll talk that way because that'll help me determine what the cardinality should be. And then we'll talk about this cardinality now over in Domo. So let's go build our first data model. And so I'm just going to log into the Domo community instance. And I'm going to come over here to data models. And let's create our first data model. So we'll just say create data model, and I will call this our Domo stats data model. And so now the first thing we do is we will define our entities in our data model, right? And these are just data sets in Domo. And so I'm going to come here and say add data sets. And so the first thing I will do is let's put in our activity log, right? That's a very common Domo stats one. So we'll come in here and oh man, we have so many activity logs. Let's just go with, yeah, this one, out of the box activity log. So we'll click plus and pull it out. And this will be our first entity that we have. And so now we can pull our second entity out and define our first relationship between those two. So in this case, if I look, user ID pops out to me. So I'm actually going to pull in the persons table or the person Domo stats. Maybe it's called users. No? Person? People, it's plural. Let's pull out the people one. Yeah, so we'll pull out the people and add it to our data model. Okay, and so now what we'll do is we'll define our relationship. So the first thing we'll do is we need to figure out what the key, what the primary key is for each of these, and then also how they relate to each other. So in this case, the user ID is going to be the key that's related. So I'm going to take this user ID, and it is going to be related to the user ID over here. And so in this case, the blue just represents a string, and then the green bubbles are going to be integers or decimal. And so in this case, you have to make sure that your data types line up. And so I'm just going to pull my user ID and put it over here. And so now I've defined my first relationship, but we want to make sure that the cardinality is correct. And so now what I'll do is I'll click on here. And then if I come over here to relationship, this is where we'll define cardinality. And so this is where, again, we'll talk a little funny here, but we'll think about the activity log and we'll think about people. So in this case, an activity log entry can only be associated to a single person, right? And so I'm actually going to flip this cardinality to be many to one, right? So in this case, oh no, sorry, many to one, yeah. So the activity log, no, see, look, I'm even confusing myself. Okay, people. So a person can have many entries in an activity log, right? You can click around Domo several times and have multiple entries line up, but each entry can only be tied to a certain user, right? So in this case, one to many, and if we go backwards, the activity log, a single entry can only be associated to one person, right? And so again, this is what we're doing. We're defining our cardinality, just like this with the crow's feet. We're doing this on the Domo side. And this is critical to our data model because then when we use this as an analyzer, it's going to do the query correctly based on that cardinality. And so I could build this out more. I actually have an example in the community instance where I'm building out like a bigger Domo stats data model where I have multiple things, right? So I'm doing activity log, but then I'm also doing cards and pages and all that. But in this case, I'm just going to save this one just to show you now what we can do with it. So in this case, we defined our entities and their relationships, and now we can actually create some cards off of it. And so this is actually very similar to just how you would create a card on a data set. But the one thing I wanted to highlight was the schema tab. This is where you can actually start to define more things about your data model. So one of the coolest things is actually the formatting is super handy. So, let's say you had something that you wanted to always be formatted to a currency, and the Domo stats doesn't have this, but let's just say if this was a currency, I could say I always want this to be a currency. And because I don't care a lot about precision, I'm going to change it to 0. And then I can also abbreviate it if I want to. But that is nice because now anytime I create something using that field in a card, it'll default to currency. I don't have to change the chart properties. So that's super powerful in my opinion. So this schema tab, definitely take a look at this. But really, once we're done with this, we can then open up with Analyzer and actually just build out a card. And so a good example of this where this is handy, let's try and answer this question. So a question that I have for this data model is I want to know how many users are doing activities in Domo by role. And so in this case, if you just did the activity log data set, you wouldn't be able to answer this question because there's only a user ID. But now that we've pulled in that dimension of the user using the data model, we can actually answer this pretty easily, right? So I'm just going to make a horizontal bar, and we'll just go by like role ID, right? So we'll just come here and say like, hey, let's count our events, and we'll do it by role. And so now, and then we'll just do this ascending, descending, so we can see which role is doing the most. So in this case, right, we can easily, right, this is a very good example of being able to use a data model effectively. You could do this with the dataset view. You could do a magic ETL as well. But data models, in my opinion, are super helpful because they also, one thing in Analyzer that they do well is that you can also see your different tables in here. And so, my role was from the people's table, but then my events was from the activity log table. And so this just shows you, right? It just explains it a little bit better, in my opinion, than a dataset view would. But yeah, that's kind of the basics about a data model. Like I said, I'll link this in the video to show you this model. But there's a couple others in the community instance that I would definitely recommend you take a look at to better understand. And if you're curious, go look at ERDs. Very fun concept. So hope you found this helpful. Thanks.